Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff.
Yeah.
The Israel-Hamas ceasefire.
Right.
You've sent us a whole
Yeah.
bunch of sources, AP News, we got Reddit,
Yeah.
even Trump chiming in.
Of course he is.
But the big question is, like, is this actually a step
Right.
toward peace, or is this just like,
Or just a pause.
yeah, just hitting the pause button on something that's just never going to end?
Yeah, I think it's a pivotal moment.
Okay.
To understand it, we have to really grasp who's involved, right?
Yeah, lay it on us.
So you've got, Hamas, who controls Gaza,
Right.
and then you've got the Palestinian Authority, right, governing the West Bank.
Okay.
And both of them, they both claim to represent the Palestinian people.
Oh, wow.
But their goals and tactics are completely different.
So it's complicated from the get-go.
Yeah.
So the AP is reporting this ceasefire just announced yesterday, January 15th, 2025,
Mm-hmm.
comes after 15 months of war. And it was negotiated with, help from Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S.
Right.
Which is interesting because,
Big players.
yeah, because those relationships.
Yeah, exactly. Not always smooth sailing.
No, not at all.
It shows that this isn't just like a regional thing, you know? It's a global issue.
It pulls everyone in.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things during this conflict has been the hostages, right?
Of course.
And this deal says 33 hostages will be released over 6 weeks.
Okay.
Prior, starting with the most vulnerable people.
Makes sense.
Women, children,
Yeah.
elderly, sick people.
Sure.
But, and this is where it gets kind of scary, Hamas is allowed to count the dead hostages toward that 33.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, like what's happening to the people who are still captive?
Right, exactly.
Are we negotiating for them to be released, or are we just okay with...
Right. Are we basically saying a certain number are okay to be dead?
Yeah.
That's dark.
Yeah, really dark.
And what does that say about us,
It's a tough situation.
Morally, for sure.
So the deal also says they're going to do a prisoner exchange.
Okay.
Israel will release 30 Palestinian minors or women for each Israeli civilian and 50 Palestinian prisoners for every Israeli female soldier.
I see.
And I can already see how those numbers could be controversial.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Because are those ratios,
Yeah.
are they fair? Is this basically is it going to lead to more hostage taking in the future?
Right.
And what about the actual risk of letting convicted terrorists back into society?
It's a tough call.
Yeah, how do you balance bringing people home
Right.
with, keeping everyone safe in the long run?
Yeah.
It's a really tough situation.
And it puts Netanyahu in a rough spot.
Oh, absolutely.
Politically.
Yeah, politically.
He's got pressure from his right-wing coalition
Mm.
who are if you give too much to Hamas, we're out.
Right, so he's got these domestic demands, international pressure, and then Hamas, who knows what they're going to do?
They're unpredictable.
Exactly. Yeah. It makes it really hard.
So how are the people who are actually living through this feeling
Right.
about this ceasefire?
Yeah.
You sent us some really powerful posts from the Jewish community on Reddit.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's a lot of relief,
I can imagine.
but also just deep anxiety.
Yeah.
People are obviously happy about the hostages coming home.
Right.
But there's just this fear.
Sure.
What condition are they going to be in?
Right. Yeah.
How many are actually dead?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this just a temporary break?
That's a lot to process.
It is. And one quote you sent that really got me was, I can't exhale until I see our hostages coming home.
Wow.
I fear for the conditions of those returning alive, and I'm scared to see how many are dead.
Yeah, that's heavy.
And a lot of people seem to be skeptical
Yeah.
that Hamas is going to honor this agreement.
I mean, they have a history. Yeah.
Of not exactly keeping their word.
And one person on Reddit was just this is Hamas.
Right.
Every ceasefire that was supposed to be permanent, they've always violated.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
And using it as time to rearm, and I don't expect any different from this time.
I mean, it's not just cynicism, right?
No.
This is based on...
what they've done.
Yeah, their track record.
So I got to ask you, how do you actually build trust between Israel and Hamas?
Yeah. How do you even begin to do that?
What does a real peace...
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's something we're going to keep unpacking as we go.
Sure.
We've talked about the official news.
Right.
We've talked about how people are feeling, the raw emotions.
Yeah.
But there's this other piece.
What's that?
The moral and ethical stuff that's
Yeah.
weighing on, especially the Jewish community.
Yeah, and it seems like a big one is the release of all these convicted terrorists.
Like one person said, it incentivizes Hamas and similar jihadi terrorist organizations to keep attempting more October 7th-like attacks and hostage takes in the future.
Yeah, it's a real concern, you know? Yeah. How do you get your people back without, making things even worse in the future?
Like, does this make it more likely that something like that happens again?
It's a tough question.
And even beyond the deal itself, people are worried that all the anti-Semitism that we saw during the war isn't just going to go away because they signed a piece of paper.
Of course, yeah.
One Redditor said, this will have and has already had catastrophic effects of Jewish communities across the world and in digital spaces.
It's a reminder that peace isn't just about, signing agreements, Right. It's about, fixing the stuff in society and culture that leads to conflict in the first place.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Then you got Trump jumping in.
Oh, of course.
Claiming that him winning the presidency is why they got the ceasefire. Yeah. And now some people are saying that Netanyahu stalled the deal on purpose to, hurt Biden and help Trump in the election.
I mean, given their history, I could see it.
It's not out of the realm of possibility.
No, not at all.
But the thing is, Trump always takes credit for everything.
Right, whether he deserves it or not.
So is there any truth to this?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's totally a Trump move to, try and grab the spotlight.
For sure.
But there is this interesting detail.
Okay, what is it?
Trump's Middle East envoy actually did join the talks, right at the end.
So maybe there's a tiny bit of truth there?
Maybe.
But it's probably more about politics than anything else.
Probably, yeah.
I feel like with political stuff, especially in a situation like this, there's always this, spin.
Absolutely. You can't take anything at face value.
Let's dig deep.
Exactly. You got to look at their motivation.
Their agenda.
Yeah, and the bigger picture.
We've covered a lot the details of the ceasefire.
We have.
The emotions, the politics, the potential problems.
Right.
But there's still so much to unpack.
Yeah, definitely.
And we'll get into all of that right after the break.
We got to be honest. The history of ceasefires in this region, it's not great.
It's a lot of broken promises.
Yeah, exactly. And renewed violence.
Yeah.
And this time, I think that fear is even stronger because people are worried Hamas is going to use this time to, rearm and get ready for the next fight.
Yeah, especially in the Jewish community. They've seen this happen over and over again.
Right.
And for a lot of them, the ceasefire isn't about peace. It's just Hamas catching their breath.
And it's not just a feeling. There are practical concerns.
What do you mean?
Well, think about the humanitarian aid that's going to be flowing in.
It's definitely needed.
Absolutely. It's desperately needed.
But
there's a chance some of that aid could be diverted to Hamas.
To help them rearm.
Exactly. It's like this constant challenge in conflict zones. How do you get the aid to the people who need it without it ending up in the wrong hands?
And we can't forget that Hamas is still considered a terrorist organization by a lot of countries.
Right, including the U.S. and Israel.
So let's talk about this prisoner exchange.
Yeah.
Releasing hundreds of convicted terrorists.
It's a big deal.
It feels like a huge risk for Israel.
Yeah, it's a calculated risk, for sure, and it's causing a lot of anxiety.
Understandably.
There's always the chance that some of these people are going to go back to violence.
Right.
Or use what they know to train new recruits.
Yeah.
It's this really tough balance, between getting your people back and keeping everyone safe in the future.
It's like they're walking on eggshells.
Yeah, every step could have unintended consequences.
So how does this ceasefire affect Israel's overall security strategy going forward?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. Are they going to be more aggressive now?
Right. Try to prevent future attacks.
Or is there a chance for them to be more willing to talk and compromise?
Yeah, I bet that's being debated right now at the highest levels.
Probably.
This could change everything about how Israel deals with Hamas.
And we can't forget about the people actually living in Gaza.
Of course not. They're the ones who've been through it.
What does this ceasefire mean for them?
I imagine it's a lot of mixed emotions.
In what way?
Well, on the one hand, they can finally start to rebuild
their lives, their homes.
Exactly. Everything that's been destroyed.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, what does the future hold?
Right. Hamas is still in control.
Right. Nothing's really changed in that sense.
It feels like they're just, waiting.
Yeah, like a break from the violence, but not a real solution.
Solve the problems.
Yeah, all the political and economic stuff that's been going on in Gaza for years.
So the big question is, does this ceasefire have a chance of leading to actual lasting peace?
Right. Or is this just kicking the can down the road?
It feels like a lot of people are feeling pretty pessimistic.
Understandably.
I mean, this deal doesn't really deal with the root of the problem, does it?
No, not really. Palestinian statehood, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees.
All the big stuff.
Yeah, all the stuff that's been driving this conflict for decades.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Right. It might look better on the surface.
But it's not fixed.
Exactly. So if they're not dealing with those issues, what's the point? Is there any hope at all for real peace?
That's a question people have been asking for generations.
It's easy to get caught up in all the negativity,
Right.
and see this as just an endless cycle of fighting.
It's hard not to.
But history has shown us that even really, really tough conflicts can be resolved.
Okay, but what would it take to actually break the cycle?
It would take a huge shift from both sides.
Like what?
A willingness to compromise, to see the other side's pain, to imagine a future where they can actually live together.
That's a lot to ask.
It is. It's a huge challenge, but it's not impossible.
Okay, let's bring it back down to earth for a second. Sure, even if we ignore the big picture stuff, there are still some immediate concerns about this ceasefire.
Yeah, like how it's actually going to play out.
Right, and Hamas taking advantage of it.
Oh, absolutely.
That whole thing about counting dead hostages toward the release number,
It's a red flag for sure.
it makes me worried about the people who are still captive.
Right, and it shows how little they seem to value human life.
It's hard to accept.
Yeah, I get that.
I mean, I know dealing with a group like Hamas means you have to make compromises,
Right.
but that part of the deal is just really disturbing.
It's unsettling.
And even if we're optimistic and say Hamas won't do anything like that,
Okay.
there's still the worry that they'll use this time to rearm.
Yeah, rebuild their tunnels, get ready for the next round.
About what they've done before.
That's where the international community has to step up.
What can they do?
They need to make sure Hamas is actually following the rules.
So monitoring and verification.
Exactly. But even with the best intentions, building trust is going to be tough.
It's a long process.
Yeah, and there are going to be setbacks.
It's like trying to rebuild something that keeps getting blown up.
Right. You always have to be looking over your shoulder.
So what else can the international community do?
They've already been key in getting this deal done, especially Egypt and Qatar.
Right.
But it goes beyond that. They'll be involved in the hostage release.
The prisoner exchange.
Yeah, and making sure the aid gets to the right people.
What about the U.S.?
They've got a tough job.
Yeah, they're Israel's biggest ally.
Right. But they also want stability in the whole Middle East.
So how do you balance that?
That's the question. They need to keep Israel happy,
Right.
but also find a way to deal with the Palestinian issue.
It sounds like a diplomatic nightmare.
It is. You have to understand the history, the politics, the social dynamics.
It's not just about signing a piece of paper.
Exactly. It's about building relationships, talking to each other, finding solutions that get to the root of the problem.
Okay, let's talk about Trump for a second. He's saying his win is why we had the ceasefire.
Of course he is.
Do we believe him?
I mean, it's easy to just write it off as Trump being Trump.
Right.
But his envoy was part of the talks at the end, so who knows?
Maybe he did have some influence.
Maybe he made everyone feel like they had to get something done.
It's hard to imagine him actually being a peacemaker,
Right.
but maybe his presence changed things.
It's possible.
But like you said before, you can't give too much credit to any one person.
Especially in a situation like this.
So we've covered a lot.
Yeah, the official stuff, the anxieties people are feeling, the problems with the agreement, the politics.
But what about everyone else? What about public opinion? How's this whole thing being shown in the media? And how is that affecting what people believe?
That's a great question, because the media plays a huge role in shaping how people see this conflict. It's a battle for the narrative, you know?
Yeah, it's like every time we talk about this, we hit this wall of just like stories that clash.
Right.
It's hard to figure out what to believe.
Who to trust.
Yeah.
Everyone's got their own version of the truth.
And with social media now, it's just like,
oh, it's a whole other level.
it's so loud.
Yeah, everyone's an expert.
Yeah, and it feels like the loudest voices are the ones that get heard.
Right, even if they're not the most, balanced or nuanced.
Yeah, it's hard to find, actual good information.
Yeah.
Amidst all the
noise.
and the shouting.
Yeah, and everyone's just so divided.
Absolutely. And the media, it's more fragmented than ever.
Right.
And this conflict with all its history and emotions,
Yeah.
it just gets pulled into those divisions.
We've seen people accusing both sides of being biased.
Of course.
Like some outlets are pro-Israel,
right.
Others are pro-Palestinian.
Yeah, and it makes it so hard.
It's impossible to know.
Yeah, to know what's actually going on.
And then you have these echo chambers where people only see
yeah. what they already believe.
The stuff that confirms their biases.
Right, and then it's impossible to have a real conversation. So how do we break out of that? Like, if I'm trying to learn about this conflict, how do I make sure I'm not just getting one side of the story?
You got to be critical of everything you read and hear.
Okay.
Question everything, right? Who's giving you this information? What's their agenda? Are they being balanced, or are they just picking facts that fit their story?
So basically, be aware of my own biases and look for stuff that challenges me.
Exactly. Get out of your comfort zone,
It's so easy to just read headlines.
Yeah, or scroll through social media.
But if you really want to understand something, you got to go deeper.
You got to look for the nuances, the gray areas.
So let's do that with this ceasefire. What are some of the big stories we're seeing? And how are they affecting what people think?
Well, one narrative that's getting a lot of attention is that this is a win for Hamas.
Okay, how so?
Well, they fought off a much stronger military.
Right.
And they got concessions, prisoners released, the promise of aid.
So that feeds into the fear that this just makes Hamas stronger.
Exactly, and that it makes future conflict more likely.
And then the other side of that is that this ceasefire was necessary.
Right, for humanitarian reasons.
Yeah, for the people in Gaza who are suffering.
They've been hit the hardest.
So one narrative is about the threat from Hamas.
Right.
And the other is about the crisis in Gaza.
And depending on which one you believe, you're going to have a very different view of this ceasefire.
It's like, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
And that's the problem with those kinds of simple stories. Yeah. They make a very complicated situation seem black and white.
And it's hard to find common ground when that happens.
It makes it almost impossible to find a solution that works for everyone.
It's like security versus humanitarianism.
Yeah, and they're both important.
But how do we get past that? How do we see the whole picture?
We have to stop thinking in those terms,
Us versus them.
Exactly. We have to see the humanity on both sides.
Both Israelis and Palestinians.
Recognize that they both have legitimate concerns.
It's not about ignoring the threats or the suffering.
It's about seeing that they both exist at the same time.
And finding a solution that acknowledges that.
Right. It's not about blaming each other.
We have to stop seeing each other as enemies.
And start seeing each other as human beings.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this ceasefire, what are the big things our listeners should be thinking about?
Well, first, this ceasefire is a good thing, but it's very fragile.
It's a break, not a fix.
Right. The fighting has stopped, but the problems are still there.
And it could all start up again.
Easily.
Second, this conflict is way more complicated than any one story can tell.
Absolutely. There are real issues on both sides.
And we need to understand them.
It's not about picking a side. It's about understanding the human cost of this conflict.
And remembering that real people are affected by this.
Yeah, their lives are on the line.
And finally, we have to be aware of how the media shapes what we think.
We can't just accept everything we see and hear.
We have to be critical.
Look for different perspectives.
Challenge our own biases.
Because finding peace isn't just about politics,
It's about changing how we see each other.
Seeing the other side not as an enemy, but as a person.
Someone with their own hopes and dreams.
Exactly. So, as you go about your day, think about this. What if they did reach a real peace agreement?
Interesting.
What would that look like? What would have to change for it to actually work? What sacrifices would people have to make? What would it take to build those bridges?
There's a lot to think about.
It is, but it's something we all need to consider if we want to see a future where this conflict is finally behind us.
Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
It's been a pleasure. Always good to have these conversations.